Hello everybody. Boxing games, they're really popular this year, so let's talk about the best way to build one. What I've got here is a complete system for a punching bag, or it could be an enemy, or it could be a something, and the character can strike it, the object can physically respond to that, and then you can get points based on how many hits you've scored. What I'm going to do first is give you a demo of how this works, then we're going to build it from scratch, then we're going to expand it even further depending on how much time we've got. So if I go straight into gameplay, what we should first see
is a set of boxing gloves which are on the table, and we can also see the item over there. First thing I wanted to show you is that I'm making use of the hands. If you haven't used the hands or you don't know where they are, I have got a tutorial about how to implement that. But if I go over to this object and try and strike it, you'll notice that nothing will happen. Even though I'm forming a fist, nothing's happening, I'm not getting any points. But if I pick up an object and move the object, you'll notice that we can interact with the object, and that's a physics object bound on effectively a series of hinges, and thus the points go up as well. But what I wanted to show here is a set of boxing gloves, which are obviously in the incorrect location, but it's just for demoing, and we can move these items around, and we can punch with them. Notice what happens if I touch the bag very gently. I got a point. Obviously that wasn't particularly gentle, but you get the idea. Notice though that points are going up no matter what strikes it. But if you strike it really quite hard, you gain quite a lot of points. This is a system that you might want to implement for saying things like, if I hit something really hard, I should be rewarded for that. Notice though there are some flaws that are common mistakes I think you guys may fall into as a series of traps. Notice what happens if I just push it. Obviously, it's possible right now to engineer a situation where you can basically always touch it and you get a load of points, and you'll notice the bag will eventually come to rest slowly. Also, a problem is you could perhaps throw things. So let's talk about how we can get to the stage
and how we can evolve it even further. So what we need to look at is how I built this starting point. What I've got in this scene is just some 3D models. This is just a 3D model from a random 3D website. It's not on the asset store, it's just a 3D asset. Converted it to an FBX, which is the file format that we need, and I did the same for the boxing gloves as well. The boxing gloves came through as a 3D model that looked like that. All I did to this 3D model was I added to the child, which has the mesh renderer attached to it. You'll see there's two of them, but I only care about this bit. I applied a mesh renderer, which I then made convex, which gives it a much more accurate approximation of the shape. Remember, it's only an approximation. And I also scaled it down. So I used the scale tool, scaled it uniformly to a size I was happy with. Just keep in mind you've got to do that to the parent, so it'll affect both of the objects. I obviously applied a texture by going to the textures that were applied and dragging and dropping those on to make a material. What you may notice though is the model only comes with, well in this case, a left hand. If I want to make a right hand, well let me show you how difficult that is. I'm going to make a duplicate with Control and D, I'm going to move that over here. Obviously I've still got two left hands, but if I use the scale tool and I scale that on the X axis, which is this one, it's going to set it to 0, and then if I go the other way around, if I scale it the opposite direction, notice how I've now got, if I go around here, a left hand and a right hand. There we go. So we can use the scale tool to create two different sides. The boxing space was a little bit more complicated. What I got from the 3D modeling website was this vintage old punching bag, which came with in the source this 3D model here. So we had this as a starting point, and all I did was use a series of boxes because I primarily cared about this object. Notice that with this object it's kind of inside out, it's hard to work out. That's just because it doesn't know what to do with its materials. So I found the texture, selected the object and dragged and dropped that on, and you can see there's three different objects there that need the same material. There we go. Why is that fighting me? There we go. So I'm not actually going to bother building the frame to demonstrate how we did this one, but literally that's just boxes. I thought it'd be interesting. What we've got here is we need to make it physically accurate, and we also need to make sure that it is bound between a constraint. We don't want this being grabbable. We want this to respond to everything around us. So in order to do this, we need to look at the box itself. I'm going to look at the pivot point. So choosing the pivot option up here and local, making sure we can see that. And you can see that this cylinder has its point of origin all the way at the top, which if I move, moves in isolation. We've also got this point, which is kind of the ring area. The point of origin is all over the place and that kind of moves like that. And then the bag itself. So the first thing we need to identify here is this object, the parent, kind of isn't the bit I want to move. So if I show you what I did over here, I created the object, I created a cube and a cube, which are those two cubes there, but notice how I changed the hierarchy. I made it so the bit at the top controls the rotation, because that's kind of how I want it to move. So we're going to do the same over here. I'm going to select the object, and we're going to change it so the top bit becomes the parent of the children. It won't let me edit it until I right click and I go to prefab, unpack completely, and then edit the bits I want to edit. So I would like that to be a child, whoops, I would like that to be a child of cylinder 2, and I'd like that to be a child of cylinder 2. So if we deal with cylinder 2, you'll notice that that now moves like that. Obviously we need this to be a physics object, so I'm going to go to the pattern, which is the actual bag itself, because I only want a collider there. Remember colliders, so I'm going to use a capsule collider here because that's a close enough fit. Colliders tell an object that it's been collided with, but it's a rigid body that handles all of that. So putting a collider on something does nothing in isolation. We also need to make sure that on the parent object we go and add a rigid body. Because these things are going to be moving really, really quickly, I always recommend you change the collision detection from discrete to continuous and speculative. We don't want gravity dragging this object down, so I'm going to turn that off. And we want to probably change its mass, because we're going to be hitting this. We want it to behave in a realistically physics believable way. A mass of 1 means 1 kilogram. A punching bag is probably more than a kilo. So I'm going to put a value of about 20. I'm not sure what I put on my demo one. About 50, but we'll see what 20 does. If I were to press play now, let's see what that does. I'm not even going to put the headset on, I just want to see what that object does. It's a physics object without gravity. I think I will put the headset on. If I go and nudge it, we expect it to behave like any floating 3D object. So I just need to restart the program quickly.
If I grab any object, it could be the boxing gloves, or it could be this box here. If I go and nudge it, we'll see that it moves as if it's in space. There's no gravity, it will carry on forever. But we want the behaviour instead where it moves on a joint.
To do that, we're going to use a configurable joint. Now this gets pretty messy pretty quickly, and is, you may change it to do whatever you like, but if we have a look at our objects here and we look at where the rigid body is on this object, you'll see I've also added a configurable joint. The configurable joint locks the X, Y and Z motion, meaning this cannot move, but I limited the angular motion for the X and the Z while locking the Y. What that means is if I look at my rotation values here, I want to lock it so it can't ever rotate that way or that way, but limit the amount it's allowed to move that way and that way. Keeping in mind, because I created this as the parent, you can also see a little arrow just there. It's hard to see, but that controls the point of origin for our configurable joint. So let's go and do that over here. I'm clicking on the topmost level, or wherever the rigid body is. I'm applying a configurable joint, and this is where things tend to go south pretty quick. Notice how it's free all by default, meaning it can move freely. So we're going to add constraints. Don't so lock the X, Y and Z motion. I want to lock the angular Y motion, and the X and the Z, I'm going to set that to limited and limited. We're going to set those limits up in a second, but for now we always test, we never trust. What we're going to look at here is how that ultimately
works. If I go and grab the object, just going to test that punching bag's not changed. If I go over here and punch it, we can see that we get a change, we get a motion. It's very snappy though. You see how it's desperate to return back to its starting point. You'll also notice the point appears to be incorrect.
So one of the challenges you have with configurable joints is they can give you different behaviours depending on how you set them up. So this object seems to be using the incorrect anchor point. So I need to look back at this object, which I created yesterday, and figure out what we did, what the properties were. So you can see we've got the connected anchor, which is the point up here. So it needs to know where it is. Let's see if that's what we did with this object over here. I'm going to turn off auto configure connected anchor and turn it back on again. I'm going to see what that does. I'll be honest. You can see with all of the properties here, it gets complicated quickly, but we really want to use this point as its point of origin. Let's see what I did with the object here. I've got an anchor of 41 on the Y. I'm going to see if that's what we did differently. So we're going to test one thing first and then change little bits at a time, because
your object may be different. Now, if you've got a punching game where you don't have a physics object like this you want to punch, you can skip this part out and jump back to the bit later on. So that is still erratic. That's not the behaviour that I wanted.
And what we are going to add on the configurable joint on the object we're testing here, I'm going to change its anchor to -41, bringing it up here. Not very easy to use is a configurable joint. I'm going to test this, and if it doesn't work,
I'll let you experiment it with yourselves, because it will be different for everybody. There we go. I'm still moving it, which is not the behaviour I expected.
Locked, 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 limited, limited, locked. I can't explain that behaviour. I'll put the properties up here. You can see what I've done with them, and you can copy them if you really want to. I've got no connected body. I've got that. The connected anchor are those values. Lock, lock, locked, limited, limited, locked on the y-axis. And I did set some bounds. So I'm just going to show you over here how you set your bounds, but may not be working on this particular one. I'm going to edit the angular limits, and I'm also going to go down to the bottom. No, I'm not. I'm going to look down to I think I changed that. Anyway, what I'm going to look at here is just edit the angular limits, and you can see already that the point of rotation is not in the correct location. It's trying to rotate around that point. Whereas if I go to this object here and I try and edit its configurable joint, you'll see that that's in the correct location. I can't remember what I've done. You'll end up battling with this because configurable joints are not intuitive. But like I said, I'll leave that up on screen for you to fiddle with a little bit later on in more detail. But you can have a play with that, see what you can get it to do. I don't know what I've changed. It could be that I've got the axes wrong. That's a 1, that's a 1. Have fun with it, basically. But the other thing that I've now got, which is the core of the making it feel good, is you'll notice that I can't push that object through this boxing punching bag, which is odd. If you grab a regular object and you try and
push it through something, it just will. So if I grab this object here and try and push it through a table, it kind of will. If I grab this boxing glove and try and push it through a table, it will. But if I grab both of them, you'll see a difference in a second. Depends on the speed in which it moves, but you'll notice we've got a really nice jumpy motion, which we don't necessarily get with that. You'll also notice I'm getting quite severe lag, and I'll show you why in a second.
So what I did with these boxing gloves is I changed their XR grab interactable, because obviously they're grab. I made them continuous and speculative. And what I also did down here in the grab interactable is I changed its movement type to kinematic. This means that you'll get a much more accurate physics interaction. I also tried fiddling with velocity tracking, but I can never make that look good. Velocity tracking is the most realistic types because it will stop the gloves ever going through a physical object, but kinematic is a good midpoint. You'll also notice I used an attach transform to change the point in which the gloves are held, but have some fun with it. So I set that to kinematic. What I've also done is I've gone to edit and project settings, and while I was experimenting I went to time, because by default your fixed timestamp is I think 0.02. That means I think it's 20 times a second. 1 over 20, 1 over 10, 1 over 5. Okay, so the fixed time step means 5 times a second perform a physics calculation. And that's the physics engine doing its thing, the fixed time step. Oh no, I've missed a 0 out. It must be significantly higher than that. But what you can try and do is, if your physics are being really twitchy, you can try increasing your physics time step by increasing the rate at which things happen. So a smaller number will mean fewer steps in between checks, which means you'll get more accurate physics. What I was experimenting with initially, and you can type values in, so 1 second divided by with a / the amount of time that you want. So if I wanted to divide by 120, I would get 120 per second, which is that number there. Pressing enter gives you that value. Have a play with it. Have a fiddle with the values. You can't really break anything, but feel free to set it back if you want to. That gave me a little bit more realistic physics over here with this object. The main crux of what I think people want to look at is how I did the physics impact. So what I've got here is a script which I've called punching, and you can see I've got a damage, a number of hits, and the piece of text, which is a piece of Text Mesh Pro that we change. So if I go into the punching script, like I said, this is incomplete and imperfect because every time a collision is detected, it doesn't care what the collision was, but it does care how fast you hit the object. And you can tweak this to your heart's content. So I've got this script which is called punching. I have 3 variables at the top, a public float for damage, which starts life at 0, a public integer for the number of hits, which starts life at 0, and a public Text Mesh Pro UGUI, which I've called damage text. And those obviously match up to the 3 variables you can see in the inspector. What I've got as well here is a on-collision enter event. If you're not familiar with how to create an on-collision enter event, type on-collision enter. It won't let me select it because I've already got one, but you choose on-collision enter, not the 2D. I just need to demonstrate it because I've already got one. On-collision enter, give it either press enter or a click, and it will create that for you. And it will look just like this. And then you can type in there the code that you want to happen when a collision is detected. I do have a couple of things in here I was experimenting with. So every time the punching bag gets hit, the number of hits value increases by 1. And we'll test that and you'll be able to see that in a second. This little magic line of code here is saying if the collision, the speed at which the collision happened, making the player strike it quite quickly. So if you wanted to do 3 points of damage, you'd need to hit it above 10, what I believe to be meters per second. else. If you hit it above 5, you're doing 2 damage. If you didn't do any of those things, just do a piddly 1 damage instead. Meaning that the number of hits will always go up by 1, but the amount of damage will be relative to the speed at which you hit it. And then at the very bottom, I'm saying damage text.text equals to the damage variable, which we're converting to a string. And what that does is I've got my UI element here, which is, if you're not familiar with how to create UI in VR, that's game object, XR, UI canvas, which will usually be very, very, very large. Scale it down, scale it down, scale it down till you're happy with it. And this canvas is just a rectangle. Move it and position it where you want. Remember, it is a physical object in the world, so you've got to move it and position it wherever you'd like. And I just happen to have this kind of grey background. That's just a panel. So I'm going to right click on the canvas, go to UI and create a panel. And I just changed its colour. That's all that is. You can change its alpha as well if you want it to be solid. And then a child of the panel, I right clicked to UI, Text Mesh Pro. I'm going to rotate the entire canvas around because the text is obviously pointing the wrong direction. And you can do whatever you like with the text. You can change its font size, you can make it bold, you can center align it. I like to center align it. You can also use the Rect Transform tool to grab the little blue control points and position them where you like. There you go, I've got the same kind of thing now. If I go back to my punching bag, what you can see is in my punching script, I've got a slot for what piece of text do we want to change. So if I were to drag that new piece of text I've made on the canvas into that slot, it will now change this instead of this. There is another bit of code I wanted to demo once I've shown that that works, obviously. So keep an eye on the punching script down here. You can see it, I can't because I've got the headset on. But if you keep an eye on that, what you should see is every time
a collision happens, every time a collision happens, I should get 1 collision, and the amount of damage should be equal to basically how fast I hit it. So if I try and touch it really gently, and you can see that it is absolutely possible to fudge by just nudging it. But you get the idea. So if I hit it with a lot of velocity, I should get a lot of value out of it.
And you can see I hit it quite a few times, but quite weakly, I think, is what was happening. So what we now need to do is to expand this script into perhaps having a cooldown time, making it so there's a delay between when you are allowed to hit it again, forcing the player to move their hand away and then strike it one more time. And also making it so only the punching bag can be hit by things like the gloves or something like that. We don't want it hitting the frame or hitting the player and that doing damage. So I'm just going to fiddle with these values in a second, but before I do, I'm now going to create a public float cooldown time, which is going to start life at, let's say, 1 second. It takes 1 whole second in between punches. You could obviously change that if you wanted to. What I'm also going to do is to create the update loop, put that back in. So I'm just going to press enter after typing update. So every frame, I'm going to set the cooldown. I'm going to set the cooldown time to minus equals time.delta time. It's auto completing it for me there. So every frame, subtract the cooldown time. That will obviously go below 0 and keep going to minus values. What we now need to think about, though, is every time a collision hits, the cooldown time resets to 1 second, or whatever it is that you wanted, meaning that there now needs to be a pause. There's nothing still stopping the number of hits going up and doing damage and updating our text, though. So what we now need up here is a public bool, and I'm going to call it something like can do damage. Starts life at true. Yeah, you can do damage. That's quite all right. So every frame decrease the time. When we hit something, the cooldown time resets to its starting value, which is 1. We set the can do damage. Oh, sorry, we need to write an if statement here. If can do damage double equals, that's not a typo, that's on purpose, true, open squiggly bracket, delete the closing one that comes in, and we're going to wrap all of this code in with our bracket. So do this only if you can do damage. But the very line here, as well as taking a bunch of damage and doing whatever, we're going to set can do damage to false. Not face info legacy, false. Just going to tidy that up so you can see what we're doing. So our logic here is set our cooldown time back to 1, set the do damage if can do damage is true, and if we can set it to false, and then the cooldown timer will go back up to 1, decrease, 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 decrease. So there should now be a 1 second delay in between punching and getting points for it. Obviously 1 second is quite a long time, but we can change that if we want to.
So I'm keeping an eye on the new text value there. I'll punch it, and I'm punching it, and I'm punching it. And let's see what I've done wrong.
I'm not setting can do damage back to true. That'll be why then. So in the update loop, if, oh, what was it recommending? Oh, that's not bad. If cooldown time is less than or equal to 0, can do damage becomes true. So the problem here is I wasn't flipping that boolean back to being true. And then the next thing I'll show you is punching it, well, only if
it's the boxing gloves that's doing it.
I can do damage, and my cooldown timer is less than 0. Why is that not damaging? Can do damage is true, which it is.
Maybe it's just too long. Okay. The way I've written this code, it's still resetting the time every time I punch it. So if I punch it within the 1 second window, it never gets a chance to reset. But if I leave it for a sec and come back in and punch it, it works. I don't like that at all.
Let's make that better. That cooldown time to 1 should only happen if we can do damage. That should be under that. No, it shouldn't even be there. It should be, sorry, there. So let's just step through what we're doing here. If we can do damage, the cooldown time gets set to its maximum value again. We can't do damage for a second. The number of hits increases, and all of our other stuff still happens. Let's see if that's more desirable, and if it is, I'll leave the full code on screen so you can pause the video and
copy it out. I have a punching bag. I punch it, I punch it. There you go, that's now working a little bit. There's now a little bit more of a delay between it. You can still cheat it, I imagine, by doing this. Still requires you to move your hand away. I think we can probably do better, but as a starting point, it's pretty good. If I just punch it really hard, I got 2 points for that, but it still hit the player, which got a point. If I hit it really hard, still got 2 points. So
the reason why I was getting 2 points instead of the maximum of 3 is just these values here. If I'm hitting it above 10 meters per second, which is really quite fast, that's the only way I get 3 points. So let's just fiddle with these values until we're kind of happy with them. The astute amongst you would realise you could swap these up for public variables up here, but I'll leave that as an exercise for yourself. And then I'll put the code back on the screen for you.
Punch. I got 1 point because I hit it quite gently. I got 2 points because I hit it quite hard. And that was it colliding with the box there. I'm going to hit it really hard. You get the idea. You can fiddle with the values and it'll work. The reason why I'm not punching that way is I don't want to punch the mic, by the way. There you go, I got 3 points. So you can fiddle with the values and
work with it in a way that you like. So here's the code. And I'll just scroll down slowly. Block at the top underneath the first squiggly bracket with our variables that we need. I've got a block underneath that with the update loop. Notice the start and end squiggly brackets. Count them up. You need to make sure they're the same number. And then I have an on collision enter event. I'm just going to tidy up a little bit, which goes all the way from there down to there. So let's get rid of the white space and zoom out a bit. That's what you're looking for. And then notice the bottom squiggly bracket, that needs to be there because that closes the class. So far so good, but we need to expand it even more because we don't want the punching bag to ever count as being punched if it touches this or it touches the player. That's not right. We can do that through tags. So I'm going to create a tag here, and I've already got a tag set up for enemy because of this demo scene. But if you wanted to create a new tag, you add a tag, click on the plus icon, give it a name. Could be enemy, could be boss, could be whatever you want. And then you assign that here on the drop down. Really important you do it at the parent where the rigid body and the collider is. Sorry, not the parent where the collider is. So the collider is there. So it's the tag has to be on there. It can be on a bunch of other stuff to do with the punching bag, but it must be where the collider is, because the collider is what is managed in the on collision enter event. So we need to look up its tag in a moment. I have made a mistake by saying that though. It's the player, so it's the punching gloves that are the thing that we're detecting here. So scrap that. We're going to say to the gloves, go find them wherever the colliders are. Same rules that we just said before. Do you know what? I'm just going to click on the parents and we'll apply this to all of the children. So we're going to make a new tag. This tag is going to be called gloves. I'm clicking on the gloves, and I'm going to change that to the gloves layer, and I want to do that for all of their children as well, literally everything. Gloves. You can do this one by one, but they should all now have gloves on them. Easier. Then in the script, we're going to modify the on collision enter event. The whole thing. If collision dot, can't just do tag, I need to get information about the transform dot tag. So that's the other thing in the collision, which is why I was getting my wires crossed. If the tag was equal to gloves, exactly as we spelled it, open squiggly bracket, delete the closing one it puts in, and put a closing one towards the bottom there. So now we should only ever count as doing damage or hitting if it was hit by a glove. So it shouldn't work if I hit it with a box, shouldn't work if it touches the player, but it should work. Gloves. So picking up the box doesn't do anything. That's good.
The gloves, however, do. But I'm not getting a point anymore. So that is, well, progress, I'd say.
It's not perfect, but it's a starting point you might want to use for your games. And hopefully that will help you guys out in no end. Thank you all.